Libertyville High School is extremely fortunate to welcome Philippa Gregory to come and speak to you today. She's not only a gifted writer, but a wonderful humanitarian who shows us that each and every person can make a difference in the world. When she was in Africa researching her novel, A Respectable Trade, she founded a charity called Gardens for the Gambia that digs wells for primary schools. She is here today because LHS intends to partner with her in this effort later this year once the IRS grants the charity status in the United States. For those who seek knowledge, libraries are our cathedrals, and Philippa Gregory has always been one of my favorite authors because of the meticulous research that goes into the writing of each of her books. Every time I finish one, I end up in the library wanting to read more about one of the historical figures that she brings to life. Dr. Gregory is the author of over 24 novels. She holds a bachelor's degree in history and a PhD from Edinburgh University in 18th century literature. We are so fortunate to have her here with us today as she tours the U.S. to promote her new book, The Other Queen. And she will be signing books after the event is over about 3 o'clock out in the library. So if you brought a book to have it signed, we'll make sure that we get that done. So please join with me today in welcoming Philippa Gregory.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can't tell you how nice it is to be here. I've been doing a book tour, and I've been night after night in front of audiences of the most respectable, literary, thoughtful women. To be in front of you hooligans is just like being home. It's lovely. And I said to you earlier, but I have to go on saying I so admire your school uniform. It's tasteful, it's appropriate, very waterproof, I'm sure as well. I really, really like how you're dressed today. I was going to start by reading a little from my novel, A Respectable Trade, and then I was going to tell you how the novel came to be written, because that's the story of how the charity came about. Then I'm going to show you a little bit of a film. We went to the Gambia with the BBC film crew, and we dug a well. The BBC film crew actually sponsored a well, so you can see the start of that. And then at the end of that, we'll have questions, some of them perhaps sensible about the Gambia, world poverty, global warming, some of them just about Eric Bana. I don't mind. And I have a great story to tell you about Scarlett Johansson that's a secret. So we'll get to that. Hang on, we're getting there. But we'll start with the novel A Respectable Trade. And this is a scene where Francis has married a Bristol trader, and the Bristol traders were very much involved in the slave trade. And he is asking her to train Africans to become house slaves. She says, "It makes me uneasy to think of them in my charge." "It's the nature of the trade," Josiah comforted her. "You mustn't think of them as people or you will get distressed. They are commodities, my dear, they are goods. And English merchants have been trading in them for more than 100 years. So long? I didn't know it had been so long. Why, how many slaves have we taken?" "Oh, my dear, who can say? English ships have grown bigger every year. The trade has doubled. The trade has quadrupled." Frances saw in the mirror that her face was shocked. "Hundreds of slaves?" she asked. "Thousands?" Josiah shrugged. "More, many, many more. Millions. It is an enormous business. 3 million slaves taken by the English in this century alone, and all the other European countries are slavers too." He smoothed her hair away from her face. "I see you're surprised," he said. "It is a mighty trade. It is the very backbone of Britain. There is not a port that does not deal in it. There is no family in the country that does not feel the benefit. We all profit from it. It's the greatest trade that the world has ever known. It crosses and recrosses the Atlantic. It makes massive fortunes. We all profit." "I didn't know," Frances said. She thought of the light, easy conversations at her uncle's dining table, of her father's gently reproachful sermons against the sins of laziness or gluttony. No one had ever questioned the ethics of the slave trade in her hearing. No one had ever thought about it. She had heard nothing but complaints of radicals and abolitionists who wanted to threaten the prosperity of Britain, ruin the colonies, and overpay idle men. "It must have destroyed Africa," she exclaimed suddenly, "taking so many people, and all of them young, and most of them men. It must have emptied villages. It must have ravaged whole countries." She tried to imagine what it would be like in England if 3 million young men and women had been stolen away in only 100 years. The country would be devastated. There would be no wealth, no farms, no industries, no roads. It would be a blow to the very heart of the nation. And the absence of 3 million people would mean that children were not conceived, that babies were not born. In the next generation, 7 million would be missing. In the next 15, there would be a gap, a gulf into which poverty and despair would flood. Inventions wouldn't be made, industries would not be developed, farms would be idle, the whole fabric of society and order would collapse. Josiah nodded. Africa is our farm, my dear. The farm produces the stock, and we ship the stock to where it is needed. Africa is a slave farm to serve the civilized world. It is a most respectable trade. That's how people thought. And one of the interesting things about writing historical fiction for me is to try not to think how we think now, but to try and think how they thought then. When you're writing a story like something like The Other Bolingo, that's quite a pleasure because you get into this extraordinarily, almost magical world of the Tudor court. Writing something like A Respectable Trade about the thinking of an 18th century Bristol slave trader was at times very, very shocking and very, very distressing and very powerful to do. At the same time, I tried to get into the head of a slave who was traded from the Gambia into Bristol and ultimately to freedom. Because the story of the slave trade in England, indeed as is often so true of the story of the slave trade in America, is that these were men of extraordinary courage, and most of their stories ended in escape. You probably won't know, and it's not your fault because English historians don't know. It's a history we haven't told very much in England, which is the story of the English slave trade. Because the ships didn't just go out from English ports to Africa, picking up slaves, to the sugar islands and to the American states, and then home, taking sugar or cotton or rum, whatever they were trading at the time. They kept slaves on board. They had this system which was called captain's perks. And so every returning ship would bring not very many, but maybe 4 or 5 slaves from Africa via America to England. And when they got to England, they would be sold as household slaves. It was a very different form of slavery in England, but it was still extraordinarily powerful. They reckon that during the 18th century, in London alone, there were probably about 15,000 slaves, and most of them were runaway slaves. These were not people who went into slavery quietly. They tried to run away at every opportunity. And in England, where they were used as house slaves, there was no training, there was no working in fields, there was no slave drivers, as in the Sugar Islands and the American and the South American system. They particularly liked to take children and use them as page boys. They liked to take women and use them as washerwomen. There was a belief that African washerwomen could get your muslin whiter than white ones. It's absurd. The insanity of the slave trade is one of the things that really surprises you. But what I discovered as I started writing about the slave trade was the incredible impact of this infusion of African ability into English life. What happened was that these page boys grew up, these footmen ran away, the washerwomen just absented themselves from work. Everybody fundamentally tried to escape. And they ran away to cities like London, the bigger cities, London and Bristol, and they set up small communities. And they fell in love with white men and women. And that's why we don't have a history at that time, because this population just disappears. They fall in love. Their next children are half black and half white. Their next children are just a quarter black. And it goes on until you cannot trace the black slave in the English population today. In England, we have some people who are very racist, who are opposed very much all sorts of things. They say the most terrible things. One of the great joys for me when I was publicising this book and going around and talking about it is that I would sometimes talk and people would make a racist comment. And I would say to them, "Tell me, where do you come from?" And if they said London or the East End of London or some parts of Bristol or Plymouth or any docks, I would say, then I can tell you it is almost certain that there is slave blood in your family. And there would be this wonderful, stunned, racist, miserable silence. And you could see these blokes, mostly men, go like, "I so hate her." And that was fine because I so hated them. So it was a kind of, spirited exchange.